Let's get started and make this worth your while. History was made a few minutes ago. You have uh, your first African American woman on the Supreme Court, your first public defender on the Supreme Court. This is monumental. This is tremendously important. It answers a constituency that is there, that is underrepresented. You've been writing about representation and should our government bodies reflect the demographics of the society, and what does that mean for empowerment and for participation? It matters. It matters tremendously. Her experience. She's a mom of a young woman. She has some of the same experiences that all American moms have, and she brings that experience to the bench. That's the thing about this. If you look at it transactionally, and that's a mighty long SAT sort of word for bringing experience to a situation. And so she looks like most or a large part of society. She has the same kinds of concerns. I believe she's 50 years old, so this is midlife. She has an enormously experienced career. Even if she had not made it to the Supreme Court, she would have been, although on the federal circuit, on the Court of Appeals circuit, she has not far more visibility on the Supreme Court than if she had not been noticed by the Biden administration. Any questions about Justice Jackson, I should say? It is just a fascinating and exciting action by the Biden administration, who really needed a win, considering that most of their legislation that they have proposed has not been successful in Congress. And today we need to start talking about Congress and what Congress is all about. And so you may not have had an opportunity to read that chapter yet on Congress, but you should. It is tremendously important for you to grasp what really is a fairly complicated concept. And I myself have to remember that many people do not realize that Congress is the engine of our democracy. Congress was supposed to be the focal point of our government. It's in Article 1. The founders can count, y'all. They didn't make it Article 2. They made it Article 1. And in doing so, what they're saying to you is that Congress is first in government, that Congress is where it's at. That's where the power is. So why do we focus disproportionately on the presidency? Any ideas about that? Anybody have a contribution about that? Why the president? Why does the president get all the attention? Someone a few weeks ago said something that was just earth-shattering to me. That they said that the Biden administration had said that insulin was going to be more reasonably priced, that prices for prescriptions were going to go down. And I said that Congress had not said that. And the person said, well, the president said so. Well, the president can say whatever he wants. It doesn't mean that Congress is going to agree with that. Congress is not there to rubber stamp what the president wants. That's merely a campaign promise. And it does not become policy. It does not become the law of the land until Congress proposes that legislation and it passes by both houses. That's the meaning, by the way, of bicameralism. Not that there are two houses, but that legislation must pass both the House and the Senate in order to become law. So there was a vote in the House the other day to lower the price of insulin to $35 a vial. And we'll see if that it passed the House. It passed the House with no Republican votes supporting it, because there's the slimmest of majorities in the House for Democrats. And so that bill then goes over to the Senate for a vote. And the Senate may be able to modify that legislation. They can add, they can subtract, they can rewrite a bill. Usually in the Senate or in the House and the Senate, two bills are filed at the same time. They may be identical. It's called a companion bill, okay? Because in order for legislation to become law, it has to pass both the House and the Senate in identical versions, which is pretty difficult to do. However, that's the way the Constitution constructs it. And it is not there to do something simply because the president says so. They're there as a counterweight to the presidency. It is not the way it is in British Parliament, where the prime minister, who comes from Parliament, he's elected by Parliament, by the majority party in Parliament, and he says, this is what we're going to do, and Parliament follows politely right behind. No. Congress is the most powerful deliberative body on earth. Mr. Woods, I see you, I'm with your comment there. They're the ones that approve of what becomes law through legislation. Yes, that's true. Legislation is a bill that's filed. And if it passes both houses, it becomes law. It doesn't even need the president's signature to become law. There are times when the president knows that he shouldn't sign a piece of legislation because it's politically sensitive for him to do so. Therefore, he does not sign it, and it becomes law anyway. And I'll show you that little trick in a minute because it's confusing as all daylights. But what it means is, where is Congress? Are they in town? Are they out of town? And that makes a difference into what becomes law. Okay, so we'll talk more fully about that. But I want you to grasp that Congress is the most powerful deliberative body on earth. Why? Why? Because two reasons. It can establish its own legislation without it being introduced by the executive. As a matter of fact, the executive may have one agenda, Congress may have another. The president goes over and gives a State of the Union address every year, usually in January, sometimes later, depending on what's going on. And the president lays out his legislative agenda. He's saying to Congress, this is what I want you to do. Congress can say, tough, Mr. President, you just go right on back up Pennsylvania Avenue, back to the White House, because we're not going to do it. They don't have to do it. They don't have to do it. That's not their mission. They are the spark of government. They pass the law, the president executes that law. He's reactive to Congress, who is active. Congress passes that legislation, the president then administers, executes that legislation. So he kind of doesn't have anything to do till Congress acts. Now, he can go over there and persuade Congress and things like a State of the Union address, but they can ignore him, and they have their own agenda, particularly if they're in a different party. And with midterm elections coming up, there's a very good chance that the House and the Senate could go to the Republicans. And there you have divided government, and absolutely nothing will get done for the next 2 years the Republicans will blame that on the Democrats and use that in their quest to be president again. Okay, so I said Congress was powerful because they can implement their own agenda. They can pass legislation that they instigate. No other body on earth has that ability. Okay? Everywhere else, you've got a parliament or a Duma or the Diet, however they're labeled, whatever they're named in a particular country. But they don't have the power that Congress has to create its own agenda, regardless of the president's agenda. Okay? And secondly, Congress, not the president, has the power to declare war. The president makes war as commander in chief, but not the power to declare war. That is Congress's responsibility, not the president's. Okay? Not the president's. The president, as commander in chief, can send troops anywhere he likes, anytime he likes, without permission from Congress. I mean, really, is he going to call up 535 people and say, I need your permission to do this? No. And a declaration of war is an extraordinarily rare occurrence. The last time we declared war was World War II. And those circumstances demanded a declaration of war. Why? Because you were dealing with two giant industrial powers that needed the entire country to answer their violence. The president is able to implement that, is able to fight that war, is able, with a declaration of war, to call up General Motors and say, hey, don't make any 1943 pickup trucks because we're at war and I need your assembly line to manufacture airplanes and tanks and jeeps and armored personnel carriers and PT boats and to help me make bombs to use against the enemy. And that is the commander-in-chief's role domestically. So when the United States declared war against Germany and Japan, or I should say against Japan first, and then Germany declared war on us, and then we declared war on them. Okay? But Roosevelt, FDR, asked Congress for a declaration of war. It was almost unanimous. It had one dissenter, as did World War I, had one dissenter. And it was the same person, Senator Jeanette. Her name just floated, just right out of my mind. I'll think of it in a moment. But she voted in 1918 and in 1941 against war. And she said, somebody has got to be a lone negative voice at times. Watch out for that unanimous kind of vote. Yeah. And that vote was taken immediately after the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and so people were ready to unite, and there was not much debate about the vote at all. Okay? So, what powers do we have for Congress? This is what you should be focused on and aware of. The powers of Congress are articulated in Article, well, in Article 1, Section 8. It outlines the powers of the presidency. I'm sorry, strike that, the powers of Congress. Article 2, Section 2 and 3 outlines the powers of the presidency. And it's interesting, both of those sections of the Constitution were written by different people. And you can really tell Congress's powers are very well defined, very clear, and the president's powers are much more ethereal, if you will, much more difficult to nail down, much more uh, vague, not as concrete as the powers of the presidency. So let's look a little closer at that, and I want to give you a website that you can visit to look at the powers of Congress. Look at this, powers of Congress. You can look at ushistory.org or another appropriate website for that. Just a simple look at the U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Very easily discussed here. The Congress has the ability to raise and collect taxes, to borrow money on the credit of the United States, okay, to regulate commerce, to set laws for naturalization and bankruptcy, to coin money, to punish counterfeiting. That's a federal crime that's mentioned directly, clearly in the Constitution. The power to coin money. They took that power away from the states for themselves because you had, under the Articles of Confederation, literally 13 different kinds of money. It's worthless, worthless. There was nothing backing that money. What, the state of New York? Who cares? The United States Congress said, no, we're going to take that power. We're going to have currency that has value, and it's going to be uniform. And that's really important. If you want uniformity, give that power to Congress. And Congress can act in ways, and we'll get to this in a moment, all necessary and proper means of executing these foregoing powers. Okay? Post offices are created by Congress at the insistence of a member of the House or the Senate. Says, hey, my district's grown, I need a new post office there. Wham, Congress can approve of a new post office. Copyrights and patents are Congress's purview. So Congress makes all the rules surrounding copyright law and patent law, so people can get the benefit of their inventions. And so writers, authors, anyone who's seeking to copyright their work has Congress to thank for that power and that authority, and no one else can infringe upon that patent. Any courts, any federal courts that are needed, we've had to expand the federal judiciary because we have more people here now, 338 million, and they take their disputes to federal courts. So we have to have more federal courts to handle that. And we'll talk about the idea of expanding the Supreme Court because that may be a necessity. Congress, like I said, had the power to declare war. It's a rare occurrence. World War II, World War I, prime examples of the necessity of declaring war. What happens is you give the president more powers than he has in peacetime. And you give the economy to not the consumer the way the economy works today. We have a consumer driven economy, but in World War II, there was a necessity to commandeer industry to make weapons of war. Roosevelt referred to it as the arsenal of democracy. And um, he did that with a declaration of war. He would not have been able to do that. To say to industry, stop being a consumer driven economy and be a military driven economy. Make rules and allot for funds for the military and for the National Guard, establishing the military and the National Guard. That's Congress. The military is not another branch of government. It's under the control of Congress and the presidency. Okay, it has that distinction uh, in its construction. Um, the the military's code of conduct is actually written by Congress, okay? And Congress, and we'll talk more about this, has tremendous oversight over the military. The United States government has the ability to punish piracies on the open seas. We don't have a lot of that going on, but enough. And it was the case at the founding. Thomas Jefferson's going to be the first to send troops to deal with piracy in North African nations. He has to deal with that immediately. He gets to test out this document written by James Madison to run Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is not an independent entity. The District of Columbia is the seat of government. We didn't want any one state or city to have the kind of authority that it would take to be a capital, the home of the capital. And so Congress has the ability to write laws for Washington, D.C. Every now and then you hear something about Washington, D.C. wanting to be an independent state. They have an argument. They pay a lot of taxes and they have no official representation in Congress. They do have 3 electoral college votes when it comes to voting for the president. But they are a special, unique kind of, not in any one place, if you will, but their own entity with the rules written by Congress. There is, of course, the elastic clause, which is that Congress has the ability to write all laws that are and pass all laws that are necessary and proper to run the country and to answer the needs of the country. Those implied powers are there in that elastic clause, also known as the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. Questions about this? I know you've got some. Questions about this? Comments about this? Why does this seem a little odd? We disproportionately focus on the presidency for 2 reasons. First, that commander-in-chief thing, that sounds like a big deal. But in 1945, it became a bigger deal because the power to use nuclear weapons, which can, in sufficient number, end all life on this planet. And it's his decision alone to use nuclear weapons. We've used them twice, killing 180,000 people that fast. And therefore, we're well aware that nuclear weapons must not ever be used again. where they're safeguarding that concept. We don't threaten people with the use of nuclear weapons. We don't have to. Vladimir Putin, by reminding the world that nuclear weapons are in his possession and saying Russia has nuclear weapons, that's a threat. Basically, that is saying, don't mess with what I consider an internal problem. This is none of your business, and I have nuclear weapons to enforce that. So, discussing this means that I know you're upset. I'm upset too. I saw those pictures in Ukraine. I've been to Ukraine. I've been all over Russia. And they're quite sincere in believing that this is an internal problem. Vladimir Putin has successfully told the Russian people that Ukraine is home to Nazis, and Nazis, that's all he has to say. Because Russians, unlike Americans, live with World War II every day. And they're reminded of it. I'll give you the best example that I can of the intensity of the use or the fear of situations like World War II arising. When people get married in Russia, it's part of the ceremony to go visit a World War II memorial and put flowers on it. And when I was there, I saw this all the time. People in full wedding dress go place flowers on the statues commemorating the losses. They lost 50 million people in World War II, and they don't want to do it again. And if they fear that there's going to be an invasion from the West, they wouldn't hesitate to use nuclear weapons to stop it. Speaking of stopping, I'm going to run real quickly and check on a barking dog for just a moment. Hold on. Rudy, 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 you come here. Come on, come on up here with me. Come on, come on, come on, come on in. Come on, it's fine. It's okay. Y'all come on in here. Don't be scared. Okay, it's all right. Rudy, our rescue dog that we've had for a couple of months, has separation anxiety really bad. And my husband just left, and Rudy thought he was here by himself, and he's not. And he didn't realize that. He couldn't see me, so he didn't know where I was. I have a ginger snap here. I think I'll let them have. It's okay, Rudy. It's all right. So, given what's going on in Ukraine right now, you're not going to see American troops, you're not going to see NATO troops go into Russia. No matter what the circumstances are, the Russians never stand for it. Another invasion from the West. Many Americans do not know that the United States invaded Russia in 1918 with the objective of dragging Russia back into the war, unseating the Russian government, or I should say the Bolsheviks and Lenin's government in the new Soviet Union. Lenin took Russia out of World War I, and 22 nations, including the United States, invaded Russia from the West, and that is a rallying cry to this day that Russians will not tolerate an invasion from the West. In World War II, the Germans invaded Russia. The Russians, all you have to do is evoke the memory of that, the cultural memory of that, even though it's a culture that's 70 plus years after World War II. There's a collective memory there that simply there will not be invasion from the West. That's why Ukraine is there, to serve as a buffer, because the Ukraine people fought both against Russia and against Germany at the same time. And so you've got a real fighting spirit for independence there in Ukraine. And Odessa and the Black Sea and the battleship Potemkin is a rallying cry for revolution in Russia. And so the idea that Westerners are going to come in there and straighten everything out and tell the Russians how to live is impermissible in Russian society and culture. And so you're not going to see NATO go in there to solve this horrific crisis, because the Russians will defend against that with nuclear weapons. Vladimir Putin's already said that, and their culture and their history say that. So, scratch that idea. We're going to get into trouble if we keep funding Ukraine's struggle against Russia with what could be interpreted as offensive rather than defensive weaponry. If we look like we are helping Ukraine, and I mean that not just with weaponry, but weaponry that could be seen as more sophisticated than what the Russians possess, we're going to get into trouble. And the line between what is offensive and what is defensive is really difficult to understand and to grasp. So we're dealing with a situation that is volatile and literally explosive. And President Biden does not want to be the president who creates a situation where the Russians feel that they have to defend themselves with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are so powerful today that what was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are like catalysts for triggering a nuclear device. They're just tens of thousands of times more powerful today. The Russians have more weapons. It's true that they may not have been as well maintained. The weapons that protect Moscow, I want you to think of this in circles. Moscow being the heart, the center, the brain trust. And as you move out, defenses become less battle ready, if you will. But those missiles, they're probably 4,000 or so, are older missiles. If Putin were to use them, he won't get them all off the ground before the Americans strike back, and we will strike back with everything we have. The idea is use it or lose it. And you're talking about maybe 2,000 independently. Those are called MIRVed. They're multiple independent reentry vehicles. And what that means, MIRV is the acronym. What that means is you have a missile, and it in flight will open the cone and have missiles and nuclear devices inside, and those are all programmed to go in different directions. That's what MIRV stands for. So you can think about 10 nuclear devices on a single ICBM, and those ICBMs would travel over the top of the world to their targets, not around the world like they do in cartoons. The top of the world's the shortest distance. They will arrive and hit their targets in the United States in 30 minutes from Russia. They move very quickly. So what I am driving at here and what I'm trying to explain to you is we have to be extremely careful with our enthusiasm about helping Ukraine, and the perception will be that Ukraine is doing the bidding of the West, and that we're behind all of this trouble that's in Ukraine, and that would be the justification for launching nuclear devices. And to understand that Western Europe is the playground for this confrontation. Note too that if there is that type of tactical nuclear weapons used in Western Europe, the Russians will roll in right behind them, and they definitely have an interest in taking back Russian satellites, Russian republics, part of the former Soviet Union, which is Ukraine, which is Moldavia, which is Georgia, which is Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which is the South Central Asian republics as well. Although there might, I think that there's a lot more interest in that than people realize because of the access to the sea, the access to mineral, the access to oil. And the production of oil, which is really the basis of Russia's economy. And so we don't want this to happen. So we're not going to send combat troops into Ukraine. We are not going to send combat troops anywhere near Russia's border. Does this mean that we may inadvertently help Putin go back and collect those former republics? And there are many who believe he won't stop with just that he's interested in the glory of the old Soviet Union, which means taking back what were Warsaw Pact. That's the answer to NATO, is the Warsaw Pact. And that means countries like Poland, East Germany, the former Czechoslovakia, Romania, those countries who were part of what was known as the Eastern Bloc. He would be interested in taking those areas. Those countries have economies. They've done well for themselves. And in joining NATO, I want you to understand that NATO is not just a collective security agreement. NATO is a force for democracy. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright envisioned a very different kind of use for NATO. She and President Clinton thought of NATO as a force for democracy, as a economic as well as military security agreement. And so what has happened there is an expansion of what was the Marshall Plan after World War II. It took a few years to implement this because all of that area was Russian controlled. But as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, the Clinton administration was busily using influence in NATO. Folks, we are NATO. We are the driving force in NATO. And what they did was spread democratic ideas and economic prosperity for folks who allowed NATO bases on their soil. When you have a NATO base, you bring a tremendous amount infusion into the local economies there. And NATO is a partner in building and stabilizing those governments and those economies. That's why everybody wants to join NATO. They also want to join NATO because of the security of not having to have that big Russian bear breathing down their necks. I have to recommend to you that y'all watch the movie 13 Days. It's about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The tension of this Ukrainian situation is not different than the tension we felt in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in the missile crisis, it's the closest we've come to nuclear war. It's the closest we've come to destruction of the victory over fascism and continuing to be a beacon of liberty and personal rights, um, it almost, could have gotten to that situation where we were definitely facing a nuclear threat. Our problem was not so much Cuba, but with Soviet missiles placed in Cuba. Okay. Congress's role in making foreign policy is that they fund foreign policy. The White House has long enjoyed a lot of freedom in establishing foreign policy, and the Constitution says that that's what the president's going to do as commander in chief, as the person who chooses the cabinet officials that actually conduct foreign policy, like the Secretary of State. Just tremendously a huge important job because they help maintain embassies and consulates throughout the world and conduct a relationship with foreign countries. This is part of the reason that Putin hates Hillary Clinton. When Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she continued that policy of NATO as a driving force for democracy and stable governments and a stable economy. And she was interested in helping Ukraine, as was the American ambassador to Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin blames Hillary Clinton for what he sees as unrest in Ukraine's struggle to be an independent nation. And so, no wonder he tampers with an election. And no wonder he relished Trump's victory because it pushed Hillary Clinton and a stronger NATO away. Trump denigrated NATO. He didn't understand the importance of it. He didn't agree. If he did understand it, he did not agree with Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton's and Barack Obama's concept of NATO as an active force, not a passive security guard, but rather a driving force for democracy. He was opposed to that. He thought that what was happening in Ukraine was infectious. Um, let's see. Oh no, problems with the Wi-Fi. Are you able to get in? If not, we tape this and we'll make that tape available to you. So you see the puzzle pieces fit together when trying to understand the role of foreign policy and how tremendously important foreign policy is to the well-being of the United States and indeed the well-being of the free world. At the end of World War II, there were two superpowers. And throughout what was known as the Cold War, there was this competition between those two superpowers for the hearts and minds and economies of the world. And communism collapsed under its own weight and lack of human dignity and a human economy. And let me say this, the worst time for a bad government is when it starts to reform. And Mikhail Gorbachev tried to reform Russia and the Communist Party with an economic plan known as perestroika. It was a third way, reaching out to have better economy at home. And glasnost, a whole idea of openness, where literature, art, music from the West could be a part of the Russian experience. And he pushed for those concepts, and the Communist Party resisted and arrested Gorbachev. It was a coup. It was an attempt to overthrow Gorbachev's government. Gorbachev wasn't very popular at home, but he was a lot better than the alternative. Russians took to the streets
and chaos ensued. And the communists said back to work, and the Russians, the Russian people refused. They said, we don't want to be communist anymore. We don't want to be led by a communist government anymore. We want democratic society, and we'll have it. And that lasted about 3 days, and communism collapsed. Gorbachev signed uh, the Communist Party leadership of Russia out of existence, Christmas of 91. And one would hope that American investment and other investment would get there and create jobs. And it didn't. And Putin blames the United States for that. What I was talking about this with a very good friend, an economics expert, and I said, what Russia needs is American investment. And he said, Americans won't invest in something until the government stabilizes. And I said, the government's not going to stabilize without American investment. And there's the quandary. And sure, you had some Western uh, concepts there. You had some Western stores open up. Wow, Chanel. Whoopee. That doesn't create jobs in Russia. You can't eat Chanel. You can wear it, but the price tag was out of reach by most honest, hardworking Russian people. If you were an oligarch and you were seizing property and seizing industry there for your own benefit, sure, you can afford Chanel. Come right on in. And what the oligarchs have done is keep Putin in power because he won't prosecute them for being criminals. And they have stripped the former Soviet Union, they have stripped Russia of her wealth and pocketed it. Mr. Putin's the wealthiest person in the world. And it's Russian materials, Russian wealth, Russian industry that he has stripped and pocketed the profits from and shared with these oligarchs. And they keep him in power and he keeps them wealthy. It's a fascinating relationship. Um, and how long this can go on, it's gone on for the last 20 years, is an interesting thing. Putin wisely lied to the Russian people, saying that the Ukrainians were invaders from the West, Nazis, if you will, which they are not. I will say this, they're probably more conservative than Americans realize. Um, and it doesn't necessarily mean a huge openness and exchange of ideas. And there's a real lack of a wealthy economy there. It has all the ability and resources to create a wealthy, stable economy. And they were doing pretty well. They were working on their way. But that would be such a huge threat to Putin that he is trying, because he's been there for 20 years and has nothing to show for it. And what he dreams of doing, frankly, to say this to you straight faced and bold, the man is afraid of the future. He's afraid of modernity. And so he is leaning on fear and repression and fear of the outside world, fear of modern concepts and individuality and individual dignity and rights. And he's afraid of those things breaking out. He's afraid that he'd have to manage that in Russia. You got all that internet that he can't control, all that Instagram and TikTok that he can't control. And what he did when he instigated this mess was to cut those things off. And of course, in Ukraine, uh, Elon Musk has made satellites possible there so that they can get their information out. But Russia's terrified of that reality. They're terrified of people recognizing that they have dignity and individual rights, because Russian government under Putin is not interested in promoting those wild Western ideas to their people. So Congress has an important duty here to maintain a level head about America, the United States' ability to influence the outcome of this mess. And so they have to keep a cool head about this. Their responsibilities really are twofold. They really have two responsibilities to the American people. First, they make law, and they make the budget that goes with that law. The budget, the operating budget for the United States government originates with Congress. The president submits a budget, it's just an idea, to Congress. But the president does not have the line item veto on that budget. So whatever Congress passes, the president has to accept all of it or veto all of it. Veto, by the way, is a Latin term. It means I forbid. And he can forbid that budget to take place if he disagrees with anything in it. So he has to negotiate that budget along. And Biden really messed up about some new ideas and new incentives to improve quality of life and the powers of the United States government. And that opportunity really slipped through his fingers because he did not manage that well, which has got to be embarrassing for somebody who prided themselves on their experience in the Senate. He should have known better. He should have known to line up his votes. And when he saw that there were votes that would not go his way, he needed to give them what is known as the Johnson treatment. And you can look that up on the internet. And what the Johnson treatment is all about is President Johnson, the former majority leader of the Senate, youngest majority leader in Senate history. And he played that role like a violin. If a member of the Senate would say, "Oh, I can't vote for that," President Johnson would find out what that person wanted and he'd provide that for them. And if they couldn't give him what he wanted, he'd put him on a plane and get him out of the country while the vote was going on. But importantly, and we talk about this more, Biden put every egg he had in one basket and said, vote for this or not. And people said, I can't. There are things in that basket that I can't justify to my voters. What Johnson would do is a cafeteria plan where each thing was funded and created separately so that people could say, oh, I can't vote for that, but I can vote for this over here. Or I can vote for that, but I can't vote for that. And that way, he could get more done and get more things passed. But Biden didn't go about doing that. He thought that given the crisis that we had just been, and I'm not saying Biden was wrong, I'm saying he wasn't effective. And that's two different things. That he underestimated how some of these folks got to the Senate in heavily Republican states. And they're going to be up for re-election. And if they go along with everything Biden wants, they're going to have to wear the moniker of liberal and they'll get defeated. So what does Biden need to do? He needs to throw lots of money from the Democratic Party to these senators who are hesitant to vote for what he wants. And he needs to make sure that they're at least not voting against him, even if they can't vote. But the majority, I mean, it's 50-50 there. And so that's a real mess when you don't have a nice cushion, a little bit better than 50-50. If he had 60 votes, which amounts to what we call cloture, then he could stop this nonsense and we can move the country forward. But that's really what you're dealing with here is a fear of modernity, a fear of modern life. What does modern life look like? Well, it's racially diverse. It's sexually diverse. It's gender is diverse, and things are changing slowly. You've got leadership now that looks more like the rest of the country. A female Speaker of the House, the first one, Nancy Pelosi. And she is a brilliant tactician and fundraiser. She is an incredibly powerful speaker. And yet, she's got enough problems there with a political party that actually tried to overthrow a free and fair election. This is unprecedented. This is just shocking that we're living through this. And it's hard to get people to understand what really was at stake, that we would be losing our democracy if that effort had um, had a outcome like they were seeking. Okay. So Congress has this ability to make law and fund the government, and they have oversight power because they make the laws. They can check up on how those laws are administered. And so you have, for instance, the January 6th committee in the House, headed up by both Democrats and Republicans. And what you've got is uh, a committee that's interested in the participation. And I don't mean just passively cheering on, but actively engaged in creating a coup. And that's what the January 6th committee is doing. And that's oversight. And that's a tremendously important part of Congress's responsibility. It's like Watergate hearings. Every time there's a crisis or some kind of serious mistake or some kind of egregious breach of the law by an administration, you're going to have congressional hearings. And that's just normal. And that's what their responsibility is to the American people. Well, we've chatted for an hour. Do y'all have questions or comments about this? You should be conversant about the powers of Congress. Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution. What can Congress do? When we get over to talking about the law later this month, you need to be able to recognize is something a state law or is something a federal law. Federal law is written by Congress. Okay? And I want you to appreciate that Congress is the focal point of government, not the presidency. Media is kind of lazy. It's easy to cover one guy, the president, but it's much more difficult to cover 535 different voices that you have in Congress. And so media focuses on the presidency rather than focusing on Congress. And when Congress has an opportunity to get some TV time, all those senators think they ought to be president. So during this hearing for Justice Jackson, you saw people making outlandish remarks because it would get them on television. And it's a dog whistle. Do y'all know what a dog whistle is? When you have a dog whistle, dogs can hear it, but other people can't. Right? People can't hear it, but doggies can. And so these things that Ted Cruz and John Cornyn and Lindsey Graham were saying these outrageous things, they did it because it would get them on television. It makes them famous. And it's a dog whistle to their following. So that's why they do it. And it's hard, it's hard to take that stuff seriously, but what it does is it gives the most bizarre theories and conversations. It elevates them to normal activities and gives people of a certain stripe hope that an ultra right-wing, militaristic, authoritarian government can be can take control. They can't get elected, so they have to make elections harder and voting harder, and they have to literally resort to a kind of overthrow, hijacking of the government. Any questions about this? Y'all are very quiet. What's going on? Any questions, comments, worries, concerns? Let's let's remember that you've got your discussion stuff. Some of y'all haven't done that. Look at the discussion stuff and respond to that, and that's going to become your writing assignment. And that's going to uh, keep us from having an icky old research paper because y'all did so well on the discussions. I'd rather read those things. And I think y'all had a lot of decency and you talked to each other with kindness. And it was a good exercise. It's really changed my thinking about how important those discussions can be. And maybe y'all prefer to ask questions through email, which is fine. I don't have any problem with that. But it's important for you to clear up. You know, I can't stress to you enough that it's really important to me that you understand the basics of how this government operates. And no, it's not necessarily the way it's depicted in film or on television news, and misperceptions arise, and so I'm here to clear those things up to the best of my ability. So, questions, comments, worries? Let's see. For the assignment, what is supposed to be submitted? What is it supposed to be submitted under? Go to the discussion page. Click on our home page and go to discussions. Click on that, and you will see. Click on discussion, and you will see what we're talking about and writing about. And when you write your response to the discussion questions, and write your own thoughts, put your own thoughts out there for people to respond to. I've added something that I hope gave the assignment more balance than when I first read it. I thought, this is not very balanced. And so we had to look at what did this mean in terms of empowering people. And frankly, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I will say this. I think it's very possible for people to think, well, it's good that we have a woman speaker of the House. It's really good because it gives us a different perspective on government, and she brings a different experience to government, very different than the people who've held that position before. But I think that just because we have women in higher profile positions, does that mean, here you go, Ruby, does that mean that the position of women in this country has changed just because we have a female speaker? You think that changes anybody's treatment of anyone as a woman? I can see an argument for not really. When you watch the display of Congress, of senators regarding Justice Jackson and ultimately approving of her, and the outlandish way that they discussed it, what is it about being female and African American that is so threatening? She's a judge. She's extremely well educated in places that used to be dominated by the good old boys network. You had to be a white male alumni of Harvard or Yale, Georgetown, to be part of the scene. And so when you have African American women or Hispanic women, Justice Sonia Meyer, you have prominent Hispanics in the House, and people who are elected and who are critical of the United States government. It really rocks the foundations of a lot of power there. And it's very upsetting to people who cling to the idea that there's only a certain kind of person who should be in power. But does a Hispanic on the United States Supreme Court, she's from Puerto Rico, does that make a difference in your life? How does it make a difference in your life? Do you feel better about your society and your government vis-a-vis participation in that government and prominent people in that society being people of color? I have to admit to you, I cried my eyes out today with happiness that there's an African American woman on the Supreme Court. I'm thrilled that I have lived long enough and lived through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and marches for equality and societal changes that were more accepting. If you did not look at race and gender, her qualifications are traditionally part of the good old boy network. Now, I will say this, she has experience as a public defender. We've never had that on the Supreme Court before. And you have cases that deal with the rights of the accused that go before the Supreme Court every day. Her perspective, her experience as a public defender is going to make a huge difference in those conversations. Those people on that Supreme Court have never represented a defendant in a criminal trial, yet they make decisions that affect the lives of criminal defendants all the time. It'd be nice to have a defense attorney around when those conversations are taking place. And now we finally, all these years after finding a country, we finally have somebody who's equipped to deal with those issues from a well-qualified position. All right, let's quit. And I will see you guys on Tuesday, and we'll continue our conversations about Congress and the presidency. Okay? All right. See y'all later. Take care. Getting ready for the next class.